Sarah Mitchell stood at the tall iron gates of Parliament House, her small hands gripping a worn envelope. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones as politicians and staff members hurried past her without a second glance. She had traveled 300 miles from her small village, carrying nothing but hope and a letter that could change everything. The 12-year-old girl wore her best dress, a simple blue cotton outfit that her grandmother had sewn for special occasions. Her dark hair was neatly braided, and despite her nervous energy, she stood with remarkable determination. This was not a child's game or a school field trip. Sarah had come to Parliament with a purpose that burned in her heart like a flame. For weeks, she had watched the news reports about the new education bill being debated inside those imposing walls. The proposed legislation would close small rural schools across the country, forcing children like her to travel hours each day to reach the nearest educational facility. Her village school, where 3 generations of her family had learned to read and write, would disappear forever if this bill passed. Sarah's teacher, Mrs. Henderson, had explained the situation during their last class together. The government wanted to save money by combining smaller schools into larger ones in the cities. They believed it would provide better resources and opportunities for students. But Sarah knew something the politicians didn't understand. Her school wasn't just a building with desks and blackboards. It was the heart of their community, the place where neighbors gathered for meetings, celebrations, and during emergencies. The security guards at the gate looked down at the young girl with curiosity. Visitors usually arrived in expensive cars or official vehicles, not on foot carrying a handwritten letter. Sarah approached the nearest guard, a tall man with kind eyes who reminded her of her grandfather. "Excuse me?" "Sir," she said politely, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need to speak with the Prime Minister about the school closures. I have something very important to tell him." The guard smiled gently, but shook his head. "I'm sorry, little miss, but the Prime Minister is very busy today. There's a big debate happening inside. You can't just walk in and talk to him." Sarah's heart sank, but she didn't give up. She had come too far to turn back now. "Please, sir. My whole village sent me here. Our school is going to close, and we won't have anywhere to learn. I promise I won't take much of his time." Other guards gathered around, drawn by the unusual situation. They had seen protesters, journalists, and angry citizens at these gates, but never a polite young girl with such serious eyes. Sarah explained her journey, how she had saved her allowance for the train ticket, how her neighbors had contributed coins to help her reach the capital. "My grandmother gave me this letter," Sarah said, holding up the envelope. "She went to our school 70 years ago. My mother learned there 30 years ago. And now they want to take it away from children who haven't even been born yet." The guards exchanged glances. They were trained to maintain security and follow strict protocols, but this situation was unlike anything in their manual. The girl wasn't causing trouble or making demands. She was simply asking for a chance to be heard. Inside Parliament, the debate about the education bill was heating up. Politicians argued back and forth about budgets, efficiency, and the future of rural education. The Prime Minister sat in his chair, listening to the various viewpoints while preparing his own speech that would likely determine the bill's fate. Meanwhile, Sarah waited patiently by the gate. She watched as important-looking people in expensive suits walked past her, their phones pressed to their ears, discussing matters that seemed to consume their entire attention. She wondered if any of them had ever lived in a small village, if they knew what it felt like to walk to school past fields of wheat and wildflowers. As the morning progressed, word of the young girl's presence began to spread among the Parliament staff. Security personnel radioed each other about the unusual visitor. Some suggested she should be sent home immediately, while others felt moved by her determination and sincerity. Sarah remained calm and respectful throughout the discussions. She answered every question honestly, explaining her situation without complaint or anger. Her composure impressed even the most skeptical guards, who had expected tears or tantrums from such a young visitor facing disappointment. "What's in that letter?" asked the guard who had first spoken with her. Sarah carefully opened the envelope and pulled out several sheets of paper covered in different handwriting styles. "These are messages from everyone in our village," she explained. The farmers, the shopkeepers, the elderly people who volunteer at our school. They all wanted the Prime Minister to know how important our school is to our community. The guard read a few lines over her shoulder and felt his throat tighten. The messages were simple but powerful, written by people who clearly loved their small school and feared losing it. One note from an elderly farmer described how the school had served as a shelter during storms. Another from a young mother explained how the school's community garden-fed hungry families during difficult times. As noon approached, the guard made a decision that would change everything. He picked up his radio and called his supervisor, requesting permission to escort the young visitor to someone who could help her. Sarah's patience and genuine concern had touched something in the hearts of these, usually stern protectors of Parliament. The supervisor, a woman with 20 years of security experience, arrived to meet Sarah personally. After hearing the girl's story and reading portions of the letter, she found herself facing an extraordinary dilemma. Rules were rules, but sometimes rules needed to bend for something truly important. Margaret Collins had been Parliament's head of security for 2 decades, and she had never encountered a situation quite like this one. Standing before her was a 12-year-old girl who had traveled hundreds of miles alone, carrying letters from an entire village, asking for nothing more than 5 minutes to share their story with the Prime Minister. "Tell me about your school, Sarah," Margaret said, crouching down to meet the girl's eyes. "What makes it so special that you would come all this way?" Sarah's face lit up as she began describing her village school. "It wasn't the biggest or the fanciest building," she explained, "but it was where magic happened every day. Mrs. Henderson taught all 6 grades in one room, somehow managing to help each student learn at their own pace. The older children helped the younger ones, creating friendships that lasted lifetimes. During harvest time, we learned math by calculating crop yields with the farmers," Sarah continued, her voice growing more confident. "In spring, we study biology by planting gardens that feed families who don't have enough food. When storms come, everyone in the village knows they can come to our school because it's the strongest building we have." Margaret listened carefully, remembering her own childhood in a small town where the school had been the center of community life. She understood what Sarah was fighting for, but she also knew the challenges of getting a message to the Prime Minister. During such a crucial debate, inside the Parliament chamber, tensions were rising. The education bill had divided the politicians sharply. Those in favor argued that consolidating schools would provide better resources, qualified teachers, and improved educational opportunities for rural children. The opposition insisted that closing village schools would destroy communities and force families to choose between their children's education and their way of life. The Prime Minister, Robert Hayes, was scheduled to give his closing speech in just 2 hours. His words would likely determine whether the bill passed or failed. He sat in his office, reviewing his notes and considering the political implications of his decision. The budget demanded cuts, and rural schools served relatively few students compared to urban facilities. Margaret made a decision that surprised even herself. "Sarah, I'm going to try something that might not work, but I think your story deserves to be heard. Are you brave enough to wait a little longer?" Sarah nodded eagerly, clutching her letter tighter. Margaret radioed her team and arranged for the girl to be escorted to a comfortable waiting area inside the Parliament building. This was highly unusual, but Margaret's reputation and years of faithful service gave her some flexibility in exceptional circumstances. As they walked through the marble corridors, Sarah's eyes widened at the grandeur around her. Portraits of past prime ministers lined the walls, and the ceiling seemed to stretch forever upward. She had never imagined that the place where her country's decisions were made would be so magnificent. "Are you nervous?" Margaret asked as they climbed a grand staircase. "A little," Sarah admitted. "But my grandmother always says that when you're fighting for something important, your being scared means you care enough to do the right thing." Margaret smiled at the girl's wisdom. In the security office, she began making phone calls to contacts throughout the Parliament building. She needed to find someone with access to the Prime Minister who might be willing to listen to an unusual request. The first few calls were unsuccessful. Private secretaries and advisors politely explained that the Prime Minister's schedule was completely full, especially on such an important day. The education debate had consumed weeks of preparation, and every minute was accounted for. But Margaret was persistent. She had built relationships throughout the building during her long career. She wasn't ready to give up on Sarah's mission. Her breakthrough came when she reached David Chen, a young aide who had grown up in a rural area before moving to the capital for university. A 12-year-old girl came here alone to speak about her village school, David asked, intrigued by the unusual story. And she has letters from the whole community? Margaret explained the situation in detail, emphasizing Sarah's remarkable journey and the genuine nature of her concern. David was moved by the account, remembering his own village school and the teacher who had encouraged him to pursue higher education. "I can't promise anything," David said carefully, "but I might be able to arrange for her to observe the debate from the public gallery. If there's an opportunity during a break, perhaps she could meet with someone from the education committee." This wasn't exactly what Sarah had hoped for, but Margaret knew it was more than most visitors could expect. She returned to the waiting area where Sarah sat patiently, reading a book she had brought for the train journey. "Sarah, we've arranged for you to watch the debate from a special viewing area," Margaret explained. "You might not get to speak directly with the Prime Minister, but important people will know you're there and why you came." Sarah's face showed a mixture of disappointment and gratitude. She had hoped to deliver her letter personally, but she understood that this was already more than she had expected when she first approached the gates. As they made their way toward the public gallery, word of Sarah's presence continued to spread among Parliament staff. Security officers whispered about the brave young girl who had come to save her school. Administrative assistants shared this story during coffee breaks. Even some junior politicians heard about the unusual visitor and her heartfelt mission. David Chen decided to take a significant risk. He approached his supervisor and requested permission to briefly mention Sarah's presence to the Prime Minister before the afternoon session began. It was a long shot, but David felt compelled to at least try. "Sir," he said to his supervisor, "there's a young girl here who represents everything this education debate is really about. She didn't come here for politics or personal gain. She came because she genuinely believes her community's school is worth saving." The supervisor, pragmatic man focused on the day's political agenda, initially dismissed the request. But David's passion and the unusual nature of the situation made him pause and reconsider. The afternoon session was about to begin when David Chen knocked on the Prime Minister's office door. Robert Hayes looked up from his speech notes, slightly annoyed by the interruption. His mind was focused on the complex arguments he would present about the education bill, and he had little patience for last-minute distractions. "Sir, I apologize for bothering you, but there's something you should know," David began nervously. "There's a 12-year-old girl in the public gallery who traveled 300 miles alone to speak with you about her village school." The Prime Minister raised an eyebrow, his expression shifting from annoyance to curiosity. In his 20 years of political life, he had encountered many unusual situations, but this was certainly a first. A child came here by herself. How did she even get inside the building? David quickly explained Sarah's journey, her patient wait at the gates, and the security team's decision to allow her into the public gallery. He described the letters from her entire village and the girl's remarkable composure throughout the day. "She's not here with any organization or political group," David emphasized. "She genuinely believes that her school is worth fighting for. And she wanted to tell you why before you make your speech." Robert Hayes leaned back in his chair, considering this unexpected development. The education bill had been debated in committees, analyzed by experts, and discussed in countless meetings. But no one had brought him the perspective of an actual student who would be affected by the decision. "What's her name?" he asked. "Sarah Mitchell. She's sitting in the gallery right now, watching the debate with the same attention most adults give to television programs. The staff members who've met her say she's remarkably mature for her age." The Prime Minister glanced at his watch. The session would begin in 15 minutes, and his closing speech was scheduled for late afternoon. His political advisors had crafted careful arguments supporting the bill, emphasizing fiscal responsibility and educational efficiency. "I suppose I have a few minutes," he said finally. "Bring her to my office, but make it quick. And David, this conversation stays between us for now." David's heart raced as he made his way to the public gallery. He found Sarah sitting in the front row, her hands folded in her lap, watching the politicians take their seats below. She looked small among the adult observers, but there was something dignified about her posture that commanded respect. "Sarah, the Prime Minister would like to meet you," David whispered. Sarah's eyes widened in surprise and gratitude. She carefully gathered her letter and followed David through corridors she was beginning to recognize. Her heart pounded, but she reminded herself of her grandmother's advice about staying calm during important moments. The Prime Minister's office was larger and more elegant than anything Sarah had ever seen. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city, and the walls were lined with books and official photographs. Robert Hayes stood behind his desk, studying the young visitor with genuine curiosity. "So you're Sarah Mitchell," he said, his voice kind but formal. "I understand you've come a long way to speak with me, yes?" "Sir," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite her nervousness. "Thank you for seeing me. I know you're very busy." The Prime Minister gestured for her to sit in a chair across from his desk. Sarah perched on the edge of the seat, her feet barely touching the floor, and carefully removed the letters from her envelope. "These are from my village," she said, offering the papers to him. "Everyone wanted you to know how important our school is to our community." Robert Hayes took the letters and began reading. The first was from Sarah's grandmother. It's written in careful cursive handwriting that spoke of decades spent teaching children to write properly. The elderly woman described how the school had served as a refuge during floods, a meeting place during community crises, and a symbol of hope for families struggling through difficult times. The next letter came from Tom Wilson, a farmer who had attended the school 40 years earlier. He wrote about how the current teacher, Mrs. Henderson, helped his son overcome a learning disability that might have been overlooked in a larger school. The personal attention and care that Sarah's school provided couldn't be replicated in a massive urban facility. As the Prime Minister continued reading, Sarah watched his expression change. The political rhetoric and budget calculations that had dominated his thinking began to give way to human stories and real consequences. These weren't just numbers on a spreadsheet. They were families whose lives would be fundamentally altered by his decision. "Tell me about your teacher," Robert Hayes said. Looking up from the letters, Sarah's face brightened as she described. "Mrs. Henderson. She knows every student's name, even the ones who graduated years ago. When my little brother had trouble reading, she stayed after school every day to help him. She grows vegetables in the school garden and gives them to families who don't have enough food. And during the big storm last winter, she opened the school so people would have somewhere warm to stay." The Prime Minister found himself genuinely moved by Sarah's words. The girl spoke without exaggeration or manipulation, simply sharing the truth about her experience. Her school wasn't perfect or glamorous, but it was clearly loved and needed by the people it served. "What would happen to your education if the school closed?" he asked. "I would have to wake up at 5 in the morning to catch a bus to the city," Sarah explained. "The trip takes 2 hours each way, so I'd get home after dark. I wouldn't be able to help my grandmother with her garden or participate in community activities, and the younger children would have to leave home even." Earlier, the Prime Minister realized that the efficiency experts who had recommended school consolidation had focused on buildings and budgets without considering the human cost. A 4-hour daily commute for elementary school children was unreasonable, and many rural families would be forced to choose between their children's education and their livelihood. "Some families would have to move to the city," Sarah continued. "But my grandmother is too old to leave the house where she was born, and the farmers can't just abandon their land. So some children might have to stay with relatives during the week and only see their parents on weekends." The weight of these consequences settled heavily on Robert Hayes' shoulders. His advisors had presented the school closure plan as a simple matter of economics and efficiency. But Sarah's visit was revealing the true human impact of political decisions made in distant offices. Robert Hayes set down the letters and looked directly at Sarah. The young girl met his gaze without flinching. her eyes reflecting a mixture of hope and determination that reminded him of why he had entered politics in the first place. Before becoming consumed with budgets and party politics, he had wanted to make a positive difference in people's lives. "Sarah, you've given me a lot to think about," he said quietly. "These letters show me things that I hadn't fully considered before." "Mr. Prime Minister," Sarah said, leaning forward slightly, "I know that closing small schools might save money. But some things are worth more than the money they cost. Our school teaches us more than just reading and writing. It teaches us to care about our neighbors, to work together, and to believe that even small communities matter." The Prime Minister was struck by the maturity of her words. This 12-year-old girl understood concepts that some of his political colleagues seemed to have forgotten. She wasn't asking for special treatment or making unreasonable demands. She was simply asking for her community's voice to be heard and valued. A knock on the door interrupted their conversation. David Chen peered in apologetically. "Sir, I'm sorry, but the afternoon session is about to begin. The speaker's asking for you." Robert Hayes nodded, then turned back to Sarah. "I have to go give my speech now. Thank you for coming all this way to share your story with me. I promise that everything you've told me will influence what I say today." Sarah stood up, clutching her now empty envelope. "Thank you for listening to me, sir. Most adults don't think children have anything important to say. You've proven that assumption very wrong." The Prime Minister replied with a genuine smile. "Would you like to watch the speech from the public gallery?" Sarah nodded eagerly, and David escorted her back to her seat. As they walked through the corridors, other staff members smiled and nodded at the young visitor who had somehow managed to meet with the most powerful person in the country. Back in the public gallery, Sarah took her place among the adult observers. Word of her meeting with the Prime Minister had spread quietly among the Parliament staff, and several people watched her with curiosity and respect. She sat with perfect posture, her hands folded, ready to witness the moment that would determine her school's future. Below in the chamber, politicians from both sides were making their final arguments. Those supporting the bill spoke passionately about the need for fiscal responsibility and educational modernization. They presented charts showing potential cost savings and statistics about improved test scores in consolidated schools. The opposition countered with arguments about community values and the importance of local education. They warned that closing village schools would accelerate rural population decline and destroy the fabric of small communities across the country. Sarah listened to both sides with careful attention, trying to understand the complex issues involved. She realized that the politicians weren't evil people trying to hurt children. They genuinely believed they were making the best decisions possible with limited resources and competing priorities. But as she sat in that grand chamber, surrounded by marble columns and centuries of history, Sarah also understood something that the politicians seemed to have missed. The most important decisions weren't always about money or efficiency. Sometimes they were about preserving the things that made communities strong and gave people hope for the future. The chamber fell silent as the speaker announced that the Prime Minister would now give his closing statement. Robert Hayes rose from his seat and walked to the podium, carrying his prepared speech along with the mental images of a 12-year-old girl who had traveled 300 miles to save her school. The speech he had planned to give was carefully crafted and politically safe. It supported the education bill with measured language that acknowledged concerns while ultimately endorsing the committee's recommendations. His advisors had reviewed every word to ensure it wouldn't create controversy or political problems. But as he looked out at the assembled politicians, and then up at the public gallery where Sarah sat watching intently, Robert Hayes felt the weight of real responsibility settling on his shoulders. This wasn't just about politics or budgets. It was about the lives of children and families across the country who trusted their elected leaders to make decisions with their best interests at heart. "Honorable colleagues," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber. "Today we are asked to make a decision that will affect thousands of children and families in rural communities across our nation." Sarah leaned forward in her seat, her heart racing. She could see that the Prime Minister looked different than he had in his office. There was something more serious and thoughtful in his expression, as if her visit had changed something fundamental in his thinking. The committee has presented compelling arguments for consolidating our rural schools, the Prime Minister continued. The potential cost savings are significant, and the promise of improved resources is attractive. But before we vote on this bill, we must ask ourselves whether we are truly serving the best interests of the children and communities we represent. A murmur went through the chamber as politicians realized that the speech was not following the expected script. The Prime Minister's own party members looked surprised, while the opposition leaned forward with interest. In the public gallery, Sarah felt her throat tighten with emotion. She couldn't predict what the Prime Minister would say next, but she sensed that her journey had not been in vain. Her voice, and the voices of her entire village, had been heard by the person who could make the difference. The chamber waited in tense silence as Robert Hayes prepared to continue his speech, knowing that his next words would shape the future of rural education and determine whether a brave young girl's long journey would end in triumph or heartbreak. The Prime Minister paused at the podium, his eyes scanning the chamber before settling on the public gallery where Sarah sat. The silence stretched for several seconds, and politicians on both sides began to sense that something unexpected was about to happen. This morning, Robert Hayes continued, I was visited by someone who opened my eyes to aspects of this debate that I had not fully appreciated. Her name is Sarah Mitchell. She is 12 years old. A ripple of surprise went through the chamber as heads turned toward the public gallery. Sarah felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment as dozens of eyes focused on her, but she maintained her composure. Sitting up straighter in her seat, Sarah traveled 300 miles from her village, alone, carrying letters from her entire community. She came here not because any political organization sent her, not because she was seeking attention or personal gain, but because she genuinely believes that her school is worth fighting for. The Prime Minister held up the letters that Sarah had given him, their simple handwriting visible even from a distance. These letters tell the story of a small school that serves as more than just an educational facility. It is a community center, an emergency shelter, a place where neighbors help neighbors and where every child is known and valued. Members of Parliament listened with growing attention as the Prime Minister described Sarah's school and the role it played in village life. He spoke about Mrs. Henderson, the teacher who stayed after hours to help struggling students and who grew vegetables for families in need. He described how the school building had sheltered villagers during storms and served as a meeting place during community crises. When I asked Sarah what would happen if her school closed, she didn't complain about the inconvenience to herself. Instead, she worried about her younger classmates who would have to wake up at dawn for a 4-hour daily commute. She worried about elderly grandparents who would be separated from their families. She worried about the heart being torn out of her. Community. Sarah watched in amazement as the most powerful person in the country shared her story with the entire Parliament. She had never imagined that her simple request for 5 minutes would lead to this moment. I have spent weeks reviewing budget projections and efficiency reports, the Prime Minister continued, his voice growing stronger. I have listened to experts explain why consolidating our rural schools makes financial sense. But until this morning, I had not truly considered the human cost of these decisions. The chamber was completely silent now, with even the most seasoned politicians hanging on every word. The Prime Minister's own advisors looked stunned, realizing that their carefully planned strategy was being abandoned in favor of something entirely unexpected. Yes, closing small schools will save money in the short term, Robert Hayes acknowledged. But what will we lose in the process? We will lose the personal attention that helps struggling children succeed. We will lose the community connections that keep rural areas vibrant and strong. Most importantly, we will lose the trust of families who believe that their government values their children's education and their way of life. Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes, not from sadness, but from an overwhelming sense of gratitude and hope. Her voice had not only been heard, it was being amplified by the most important leader in the country. The Prime Minister set his prepared speech aside completely and spoke directly from his heart. I entered politics because I believed that government should serve all citizens, not just those in wealthy urban areas. Today, a brave young girl reminded me of that principle. She reminded me that efficiency and cost-cutting are not always the highest values we should pursue. Opposition members began nodding in agreement. While some government supporters looked increasingly uncomfortable, the political calculations that had seemed so clear that morning were being challenged by moral arguments that were difficult to ignore. I am therefore announcing that I cannot support this education bill in its current form, the Prime Minister declared, causing an audible gasp throughout the chamber. Instead, I am calling for the formation of a special committee to work with rural communities to find solutions that preserve local schools. While addressing our fiscal challenges, the chamber erupted in surprised murmurs and excited conversations. Political reporters in the press gallery began frantically typing on their phones. Knowing they were witnessing a significant and unexpected political moment, Sarah sat in stunned silence, hardly believing what she was hearing. Her simple journey to deliver a letter had somehow changed the course of national policy. The Prime Minister continued speaking, outlining his vision for a new approach that would involve rural communities in finding creative solutions. We with lead line. Shared resources between schools, but we will do this with the input and partnership of the people who know these communities best, the families, teachers, and students who call rural areas home. The political implications of this announcement were enormous. The Prime Minister was essentially rejecting a key piece of his government's legislative agenda based on a conversation with a 12-year-old girl. His advisors knew that opposition parties would celebrate this apparent victory, while his own supporters might question his leadership and judgment. But Robert Hayes had made his decision based on something deeper than political strategy. Sarah's visit had reminded him of the real purpose of public service: to protect and improve the lives of ordinary citizens, especially those whose voices were often overlooked in the corridors of power. Some will say that I am being swayed by emotion rather than logic, the Prime Minister continued, looking directly at Sarah in the gallery. But I believe that the best policies are those that combine fiscal responsibility with human compassion. Young Sarah Mitchell has shown us that wisdom can come from unexpected sources, and that sometimes the most important voices are the quietest ones. The chamber remained transfixed as the Prime Minister concluded his speech. He had turned what was expected to be a routine endorsement of committee recommendations into a powerful statement about values, community, and the responsibility of government to listen to all citizens. As he returned to his seat, the opposition erupted in applause while his own party members sat in shocked silence. The political ramifications would unfold over the coming days and weeks, but in that moment, Sarah felt a profound sense of accomplishment and gratitude. Margaret Collins, the security chief who had made Sarah's meeting possible, watched from the staff area with tears in her eyes. In her 20 years of protecting Parliament, she had never seen such a dramatic example of democracy in action. A young girl's courage and a leader's willingness to listen had combined to create a moment that would be remembered long after the political details were forgotten. The Parliament chamber buzzed with excitement and confusion as politicians tried to process what had just happened. The Prime Minister's unexpected announcement had completely changed the political landscape, and nobody was quite sure what would happen next. Sarah remained in her seat, Overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she had witnessed, David Chen appeared at her side, his face beaming with pride and amazement. "Sarah, you did it," he whispered. "You actually changed his mind." "I didn't think he would really listen to me," Sarah replied, her voice shaky with emotion. "I just wanted him to know how we felt." As the session concluded and politicians filed out of the chamber, many of them looked up at the public gallery with curiosity about the young girl who had somehow influenced such a dramatic policy reversal. Some smiled and waved at her, while others shook their heads in disbelief at the unexpected turn of events. Margaret Collins arrived to escort Sarah from the gallery, her face radiating satisfaction at having made the right decision earlier that day. "Well, young lady, I think you've had quite an impact on our parliament today." As they walked through the corridors, Sarah found herself surrounded by staff members who wanted to meet the girl who had captured the Prime Minister's attention. Everyone seemed genuinely impressed by her composure and the respectful way she had presented her community's concerns. "How did you know what to say?" asked a young secretary who had grown up in a small town herself. "I just told the truth," Sarah replied simply. "My grandmother always says that the truth is the most powerful thing you can share with someone." Word of Sarah's story spread quickly throughout the building. Janitors paused their work to hear about the brave girl from the countryside. Kitchen staff preparing tea for politicians shared details of her respectful demeanor and heartfelt mission. Even the most cynical veterans of political life found themselves moved by the pure motivation behind her visit. Robert Hayes returned to his office to find it filled with advisors, party officials, and staff members, all trying to understand the implications of his decision. His phone was ringing constantly with calls from journalists, political analysts, and fellow politicians wanting to know what had prompted such an unexpected policy reversal. "Sir, we need to discuss the political ramifications of your speech," said his chief advisor, looking stressed and concerned. "The opposition is claiming victory, and some of our own members are questioning your judgment." The Prime Minister listened patiently to the various concerns and criticisms, but his mind kept returning to his conversation with Sarah. The political calculations that normally dominated his thinking seemed less important now than the human impact of his decisions. "Set up a meeting with the education minister," he instructed. "I want to begin working on the new committee structure immediately, and I want Sarah's village school to be the first one we visit when we start our community consultations." His advisors exchanged worried glances, realizing that their leader was serious about following through on his public commitment. The easy political path would have been to quietly modify his position over the following weeks. But Robert Hayes seemed determined to honor the promise he had made to a 12-year-old girl. Meanwhile, Sarah was being prepared for her journey home. Margaret Collins had arranged for a car to take her to the train station, and David Chen had purchased her ticket to ensure she would have a comfortable trip back to her village. "Sarah," Margaret said, as they prepared to leave Parliament, "what you did today was extraordinary. You came here as one young person with a simple request, and you've changed the direction of national policy. That's something most adults never accomplish in their entire lives." Sarah smiled gratefully but remained modest about her achievement. "I just did what my grandmother told me to do. She said that when something is important enough, you have to be brave enough to speak up for it." As the car pulled away from Parliament House, Sarah looked back at the imposing building where her adventure had unfolded. Just that morning, she had been a nervous girl standing at the gates with a letter in her hand. Now she was returning home as someone who had made a difference in the lives of thousands of children. Across the country, the train ride home gave Sarah time to reflect on everything that had happened. She thought about Mrs. Henderson and wondered if the teacher was watching the news coverage of the parliamentary session. She imagined her grandmother's reaction when she heard that the Prime Minister had read her letter aloud to the entire Parliament as the countryside rolled past her window. Sarah felt a deep sense of satisfaction. She had kept her promise to her community, and their voices had been heard by the most important people in the government. The fight to save rural schools was far from over, but for the first time in months, there was real reason for hope. The other passengers on the train began recognizing her from the television coverage, and several people approached to congratulate her on her remarkable day. An elderly farmer shook her hand and thanked her for standing up for rural communities. A young mother with children praised her courage and determination by the time Sarah arrived at her home station. Word of her success had already reached her village. A small crowd had gathered to welcome her back, including Mrs. Henderson, her grandmother, and neighbors who had contributed to the letters she had delivered to Parliament. The small train station in Sarah's village had never seen such excitement. As her train pulled in, she could see familiar faces pressed against the windows of the station building. And a modest crowd had gathered on the platform despite the evening chill. Her grandmother stood at the front of the group, her eyes bright with pride and relief at seeing her granddaughter. Safely home, Sarah stepped off the train carrying the same worn envelope. Now empty but somehow more precious than when she had started her journey, Mrs. Henderson was the first to reach her. Wrapping her in a warm hug that spoke of gratitude beyond words, "Sarah, dear, we watched the entire session on television," her teacher said, tears streaming down her cheeks. "When the Prime Minister held up our letters and spoke about our school, I could hardly believe it was really happening." The villagers surrounded Sarah with gentle enthusiasm, everyone wanting to hear firsthand about her extraordinary day. Tom Wilson, the farmer whose letter had moved the Prime Minister, shook her hand with calloused fingers that trembled slightly with emotion. "Little Sarah, you did something today that none of us adults had the courage to try," he said gruffly. "You saved our school and our community." Sarah's grandmother took her hand and led her through the crowd toward their small cottage. As they walked down the familiar dirt road, past fields where Sarah had played as a child, she felt the contrast between the marble corridors of Parliament and the simple beauty of her rural home. "Grandmother, did I really do the right thing?" Sarah asked as they reached their garden gate. "Some people on the train said the Prime Minister made a mistake by listening to a child instead of experts." Her grandmother stopped and cupped Sarah's face in her weathered hands. "My dear girl, you did exactly what needed to be done. You reminded powerful people that behind every policy and every budget line, there are real families and real communities. Sometimes adults get so focused on numbers and politics that they forget about the human hearts that will be affected by their decisions." Over the following weeks, Sarah's story continued to resonate far beyond her village. Newspapers across the country wrote articles about the young girl who had changed government policy through courage and sincerity. Television programs interviewed education, experts who praised the Prime Minister's decision to involve communities in finding solutions to rural school challenges. The special committee that Robert Hayes had promised was established within a month, and its first official visit was indeed to Sarah's village school. The Prime Minister arrived with education specialists, budget analysts, and journalists. But his first stop was a private meeting with Sarah and her family. "Wanted to thank you again for opening my eyes to something I should have understood from the beginning," he told her as they sat in her grandmother's modest living room. "Politics can make people forget that every decision affects real lives." The committee's visit to the school revealed the kind of innovative solutions that Sarah had tried to describe in her letters. Mrs. Henderson had created partnerships with local farmers to provide hands-on science education. Older students mentored younger ones in reading programs that improved literacy rates beyond what many urban schools achieved. The school's community garden not only taught biology, but also provided fresh food for families facing financial hardship. The committee members, who had arrived expecting to find an outdated facility in need of consolidation, instead discovered a model of educational efficiency and community engagement that could be replicated in other rural areas. The personal attention that each student received, the integration of practical life skills with academic subjects, and the school's role as a community center created value that couldn't be measured purely in economic terms. 6 months after Sarah's visit to Parliament, the government announced a new rural education initiative that provided additional funding for small schools while helping them develop innovative programs and technology resources. The policy became a model for other countries facing similar challenges with rural education. Sarah returned to her normal routine as a student, but her experience had changed her in subtle ways. She was more confident in expressing her opinions, more aware of how government decisions affected ordinary people, and more convinced that individual voices could make a difference in the world, her teacher, Mrs. Henderson, incorporated Sarah's experience into civics lessons, using it to show students that democracy worked best when citizens actively participated in the process. The story became a favorite example of how young people could contribute meaningfully to their communities and their country. Years later, when Sarah graduated from her village school and went on to university, she chose to study public policy and community development. Her professors were impressed by her mature understanding of how government decisions affected real people, and her classmates were inspired by her story of childhood activism. The small school that Sarah had fought to save continued to thrive, serving new generations of village children while maintaining its role as the heart of the rural community. The building was eventually renovated with government funds, but the most important changes were invisible: the renewed sense of hope among families who knew their voices mattered, and the knowledge that sometimes the most powerful person in the country would listen to the concerns of the smallest citizen, Sarah's. Empty envelope was framed and hung in the school's main hallway, accompanied by a photo of her meeting with the Prime Minister and copies of the letters from villagers who had trusted a 12-year-old girl to carry their hopes to Parliament. It served as a daily reminder to students that courage, sincerity, and determination could overcome the barriers that separated ordinary people from those in power. The story of Sarah Mitchell became a legend in political circles, frequently cited by leaders who wanted to emphasize the importance of listening to constituents. But in her village, she remained simply Sarah, a young woman who had grown up knowing that even the quietest voices deserved to be heard, and that sometimes the most important journeys began with a single step toward an imposing gate.